Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So I am Matt Gagan. I'm going to take the reins for most of the rest of the session here. Chris is going to interrupt me as and when he sees questions coming up that you're going to post in the chat here. So without further ado, let's proceed with this discussion today. So I was thinking we'd break this down into three sections, really, kind of a high-level overview. How does Reltio play well in customer ecosystems? And how does that break down into different kind of categories of playing or integration? And then zooming in on one particular pattern, we'll talk about the Reltio API developer portal, and then we'll make use of some of those APIs as we discuss a principle that we see being led by our partner MuleSoft that they call API-led integration, really the use of services and microservices wrapped up as APIs in orchestrating interactions between different systems and one another. And then, of course, we'll open it wide up to questions towards the end. So with this schematic that we're presenting right here, with Reltio at the heart of things, Reltio on its backbone of innovative and scalable new technologies is exposing all of these capabilities to you as Reltio customers via an extensive collection of REST APIs, as well as pushing outbound events of things going on inside of the Reltio platform via its streaming APIs. And then Reltio provides a number of packaged capabilities that leverage each of these layers so as to be able to provide useful experiences as well as integrations where appropriate. So you've got your Reltio user experiences for administrators, for data stewards, for business users. You've got an integration to DMB. You've got a prepackaged integration for Salesforce. And then we've got capabilities to import data and export data to different types of file formats. So when we think about the rest of the ecosystem, how can they talk to one another and how can they talk to a system like Reltio? Of course, it's going to make use of these APIs. So as I click forwards here, you'll see a category of integration that we would call synchronous. This is the use of these APIs on demand to get answers to burning questions. Who is this customer? What is this customer's consent? And of course, given the way customers are making use of Reltio in their ecosystems, this means that many of these questions can usefully be answered using Reltio's API layer. And so there are solutions like MuleSoft, which we're going to focus on as a specific example here, that are making use of layers of API interaction to various solutions in order to get those answers in a modular way, regardless of who is asking the question. So whether it's the website trying to identify their currently logged in customer, whether it's another kind of app, whether it's a loyalty system or some other solution within the organization, the idea is there should be a repeatable mechanism that is going to reliably get us the answers to the set of questions that we have, identifying and then understanding the customer. So if this is the synchronous category, then there are also streaming capabilities, and we can talk about Kafka, AWS Kinesis, and various other pub sub or streaming mechanisms that are out there. And customers are making use of these to perform asynchronous communication and updates across systems. So these are not so much on demand, but rather notification frameworks, where if something changes in Reltio or if something changes in the ERP system or the website regarding its understanding of a customer or the arrival of a new transaction, this is an opportunity to post that onto a shared vehicle, a message bus or a stream or a topic in the case of Kafka that can then be picked up by any subscribing system that has the right and the need to leverage that and update its own records in an appropriate kind of time frame. And so this is very much near real time, whereas these APIs need to be on demand. They are synchronous, they are in real time, and they need to turn around and answer to the questions very, very quickly. And so with regard to the session today, we're going to focus on part one first, which is let's see if we can understand how to use these Reltio REST APIs. And then subsequently, we'll move on to a part two where we'll look at the usage of those in a MuleSoft context. And you'll have also seen with regard to these connectors I've talked about that Reltio is packaging up, there are also capabilities to push information downstream to customers, analytics and reporting environments to serve those kinds of purposes as well. But here we're talking about operational needs, getting data on demand. So let's move forwards.
So we have one comment already, so this is going to be perfect, I think. But he says, we have exactly that problem you've mentioned. A customer is registering to one of our applications or web, and we struggle to understand that this account exists in our database. So you're on the right track.
Excellent. Good to hear. If there are any questions that we need to follow up on that comment, then also post those, please. So let's talk about the Reltio API Developer Portal. And I don't have slides for this. It's more a case of let's go and show you what the portal looks like and enjoy that developer experience. So I'm going to segue now to my web browser. Here we're logged in to the Reltio documentation portal. And what you'll see here is there's a hyperlink to the developer portal here. So when I click on this, we're taken to another page. Still logged in, this is where we can see how Reltio is making use of Swagger. We're organizing the APIs into a number of different categories. So configuration, ingestion of data and update of data, operation, really meaning using those APIs to get answers to questions like I was just alluding to before, other kind of integration requirements, and then the management of the application with regard to tasks as a whole. So if we go into this world of operating with Reltio, there's a default environment among all of the environments that I've got access to here that's been selected. This is my demonstration environment, Google US Sales. And we're going to work with entities as an example. So what different operations can I perform using or leveraging entities? I'm going to make use of this first one. So I'm going to be querying for entities inside of Reltio. Here you can see the Swagger framework is giving you guidance as to what the various parameters are that can be used in working with this particular API, and is also providing you samples, examples of what some of these payloads or parameters could look like. So if you want to try this out now, let's go ahead and click on the button, prompting me to put in the ID of a particular demonstration tenant that I want to work with and test out. That's this tenant here, which has just under 1 million consumer profiles in it. And we'll see some of these records and we'll work with some of these shortly. Let me copy this tenant ID back into my Swagger environment. And then I'm going to test out one of these APIs. And rather than just search broadly for any entity of type individual, which of course might return me anything up to 850,000 records. Let's be very specific about somebody I want to search for here. So let's search for an individual whose name is Ronnie Balla. Go back in and append this as an additional criteria to this filter. And then let me scrub the specific things I'm asking for in the payload and say, just give me everything that's available to me, given my security credentials. And let's go ahead and run this API call. So there's a representation of what was the actual request that was made. And then what you can see in my return payload, my response body, is we've got our individual back. And that, as we scroll through, he is known interchangeably as Ronnie with no E and Ronnie Balla, his first name, his last name, his membership of different programs, etc. So along, in my case, verbose JSON response expressing everything that I could possibly be entitled to know about this individual. So I've just successfully used this developer portal to test out one particular API call, just to give you a kind of a quick idea of how this whole thing works. And if I was to shrink this up, you can see that there are numerous others that I potentially want to work with. When I think about all the different situations I find myself in, what do I find myself knowing about the customer, and how do I want to use that to query for and retrieve an understanding of that customer in Reltio. It just so happens, because I was very careful, that I used a first name and a last name that I know exists. But what if there was a typo in my representation? What if I didn't have complete information? How else would I work with that? And that's where we find ourselves needing to segue to this whole category of API-led integration. So if we go back to our slides now and start to talk about this MuleSoft API-led integration, how is this going to help me in the requirements that I was just articulating? So back to our original diagram, it's these synchronous needs, and we're going to be focusing on number 2 now. What does this thing do that's going to help me with my objectives? So the way that MuleSoft represents this concept of API-led integration is really to think about APIs as different layers that can then be used in a modular way so as to get different sets of answers to commonly asked questions. So when we think about a system like Reltio, as we just saw, exposes itself to you and to your integration tools and platforms using its REST APIs, and there are numerous of those APIs. And based on your needs, you're going to want to use those perhaps in sequence in order to try to work out and get answers to important questions like, who is this customer and what do I need to know about them? And that's true not only of Reltio, but of all other kind of players out there that expose themselves using their APIs. So there should be a get Salesforce customer that probably uses a number of different parameters to go and identify and retrieve a customer record from Salesforce, and so on. So once you've got these granular sets of services, if you will, or microservices or APIs stood up, they can then be used and stitched together in a meaningful way to get and service the experience needs that we see represented in this experience layer. So think of these as just more granular sets of services being called by slightly coarser grain services, then ultimately supporting experiences that a user may need in a portal or a customer service internal user needs in order to meet their particular needs. So when we break this down, what could a Reltio get customer 360 look like? Then this would be a process API sitting in that middle layer. It would go initially to Reltio because Reltio is probably the best place to go to understand who the customer is from across our entire ecosystem. At the same time, get an understanding of the customer's household, because arguably that can be best served in Reltio. Get their omni-channel journey status, because there's an opportunity to be able to support that inside of Reltio, and get any preferences and segmentation that through analysis of your omni-channel customer could be agilely supported using attributes and other mechanisms inside of Reltio. And then once you've got this information, there's an opportunity where appropriate, where the needs require it, to go to other sources like Salesforce, like the ERP system, like the loyalty database, for example, to get additional information. So let's zoom in a little deeper on this particular concept. We can really break this down by an initial query that's going to try to find the customer using an ID, if we think we know what the ID is in the context of a source application. If we don't have that, then we're going to want to use some fragments of data that represent the customer, perhaps using names, email addresses, phone numbers, physical addresses. And we're going to try to query directly for an exact match to that customer. And then if we can't fulfill that requirement, we don't find an answer to that question, then we're going to try and leverage match rules to, as a safety mechanism, as a safety net, see if we can find a good, confident match to the criteria that we have available to us. And if we exhaust all of those, then we're probably in the context of dealing with a brand new customer. And then returned by Reltio, what we're going to find is in the responses to any of these queries, Reltio will provide crosswalks. These will be, what are all the different systems and what are the IDs within those systems that this customer is known to us by? Reltio can provide the multi-channel communication consent. So going across all of those different systems, what consent has been provided, sometimes in conflict with one another, by the customer at different points in time, so that I can understand the big picture and understand what I need to do right now to service this customer's needs and engage them in a legally appropriate way. And then in terms of leveraging our relationship with this customer and providing win-win experiences, I want to understand this customer's journey status, their preferences, any propensities I've derived, any segmentation that I've derived that gives me a more complete understanding of this customer. So let's get a little bit deeper into that.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
Quick question. Is there an option to contain, number of attributes and child entities in the result payload Reltio API is providing as response? So that's one question. And can we optimize the API response time by limiting attributes and child entities?
Absolutely. So there's a high level parameter that you can, in getting a customer response, you can use to limit the number of records that could be returned. Obviously, in a situation like we're dealing with here, we're not expecting a large number of records to be returned because we think we're trying to find that one customer who appears to be known to us. But then to the second point in your question, the thing that you saw me scrub out in my Swagger developer portal, that was a long list of things that can be returned by my API call. If you start to use those, then it will only return you those different parts of the payload that are specified in that particular parameter. So you can be very selective as to exactly which pieces of information are brought back, and therefore a more compact response, which ideally can then be turned around in a faster time frame.
Great. If there's additional follow-up, please let us know. And another question, and then I'll let you go on to the presentation. How can we utilize match rules for queries? So can you go in depth with that? And how is it good or bad than other search queries?
So I'll describe as best I can why match rules can be very useful here. And I'll do it in the context of what you're looking at on screen right now. So I'll move forward with this, and then if other questions come up, Chris, then just interrupt me as you find appropriate.
Thanks, Matt.
So what we're looking at is a screen grab of the MuleSoft Anypoint Studio with a particular API that I developed, which is designed to carry out exactly the task I was just describing on the previous slide. Basically, to set up and listen for a request for information, and then to go through a decision process, which is to say, did the original payload have a customer ID represented in it? Because ideally, that's then going to be the best answer to the question. And I'll follow this pathway, and I'll use this particular API that Reltio makes available called getEntity by Crosswalk. And I'm going to assume that the source system ID and the source system label are going to get me the answer to the question and find me the customer I'm looking for. But if that's not the case, and instead I've got a bunch of query parameters that might be first name, last name, and the other kinds of things we were talking about before, I'm going to follow this other pathway, and I'm going to prepare myself to make an API call called search. And this is exactly the API call you saw me leverage in the Swagger documentation, where I prepare my filters, my query criteria, and I invoke this API call from within the MuleSoft environment right here. And then I deal with what it is that was returned to me. As an aside, and not used in this particular API, there is the ability to package that payload up in a way that instead of searching for exact results, actually invokes a fuzzy mechanism, which will make use of Reltio's embedded Elasticsearch concept of fuzzy, which is really kind of exchange of an interchange of characters and transposition of characters, so that you can get fuzzy around the edges. If you didn't quite get the first name right, you didn't quite get the last name right, for example. But in this case, we're doing a strict, can I get the exact criteria to be fulfilled? And then as I deal with my resulting payload, I'm going to make a decision. Did it actually contain anything meaningful, or was it empty? If it was empty, and here technically the size of the payload was 0, then I'm going to go and prepare another call. And this is where I'm going to call Reltio's matching API. And in this case, all of the match rules for the entity type in question that have been exposed for external use, which of course is something that you're under control over inside of Reltio, will then be invoked using that payload that I just prepared for it. So the first name, the last name, and everything else. And will then try to find me the best possible answer to that question. And so getting back to the last question you asked, Chris, here, this is where there's a certain amount of flexibility that's brought to the table, because even though the customer may have said, here's my first name, my last name, my middle name, my address, my email address, whether that was in a form and they could have fat fingered it, or whether it's over the phone and I'm fat fingering it or mishearing it and typing it into my query, this API, if it's not leveraging something that I happen to have put a typo into, or if it's leveraging a fuzzy comparison as part of the underlying set of match rules, there's a certain tolerance for that inaccuracy, and there's still a good chance potentially of finding the customer record that we were looking for and getting the result at the end point here. If all of those things have failed, then that's where we find ourselves in the situation. So all of these represent endpoints where this API is going to come back to me and tell me what it found. And so as we move forwards, here are the labels just recapping on what it is that we're talking about here. Source system ID exists. Let's go try and use that. No source system ID. Let's do an exact query via attributes. Can't find anything using those criteria. Let's try the match rules as a safety net. So all the way back to our original concept, I want to test out what it is that we were just looking at, which is really that screen grab represents this API that has been deployed in the MuleSoft cloud, and in turn is pointing to my Reltio demo environment that we just saw as we were just looking at earlier. And I'm going to make use of this demonstration application. So this is just an HTML app with some JavaScript in it. It's going to prepare API calls to ping this API with different sets of parameters, and we'll see how it responds to those different parameters and brings us back results that we are looking for. So this is demonstration time. So I'm going to go back to Google Chrome to start with, because if we go back to my search environment, this is my target tenant that my MuleSoft API is pointing at. And let's take a look at some interesting records. So I've got some target records here, and you saw me already make use of one of these in a previous API call via the Swagger documentation. That would be this individual here. Let's just click on him to see what it is that we know about the individual. And as you can see, it's that membership details that were being returned in my JSON payload, and some multi-channel communication consent, as well as a bunch of contact attributes, phone numbers, addresses, and email addresses, and a whole bunch of other information besides. So with those in mind, let's go to my demonstration app, and let's query for this Ronnie Balla. And let's switch on the JSON payload that I'm sending to the MuleSoft API. So that's going to appear here. And if I click Get Customer, with this current payload, which happens to have an incorrect representation of the ID, it's telling me, because this was the way I designed the API, it can't find the customer using the source and the ID that was presented. So it's an opportunity for the calling application to rethink in this particular situation. But if I scrub out this ID, then it's going to follow a different pathway in the actual API that I'm calling. And if I call it now, this time it's saying you found the customer using exact attributes, and here's the payload that came back. And I'm breaking the payload into two chunks here, but a lot of this was something that we saw in the original verbose JSON from my developer portal. Here, I've taken the opportunity within my MuleSoft environment to strip down the JSON to just the bare minimum that I think will be meaningful to send back to my calling application. So that consists of the customer, their contact details, all of the details around the phone number having been standardized and cleansed, and so on through to the physical addresses and the rest of the payload. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the representation of the list of crosswalks or contributing sources and IDs for this record. So coming from legacy MDM, we have this ID. Coming from the website knows the customer using this particular identifier. There was a Reltio UI contribution that overrode some of these data points, and that uses this ID, and so on, down this fairly complicated payload representing this customer. And I've set this up so that we can try a few different queries here. So I could say, let's find Ronnie only using match rules. And as I switch to this, you may have just noticed that the phone number changed. So this would be an example of somebody fat fingering. Now, if I did an exact query for all of these parameters being true at the same point in time, one of them is going to fail, and that's that the phone number is going to fail. And with that failing, we're going to see a different pathway being followed. So I say get customer now. We still find the same customer record, but the explanation is one that was derived by us following a different pathway through that API. Having failed to find the customer using all exact criteria, it was found using an exact a match rule that does an exact match on first name, last name, and an exact or null on email, meaning it skipped over the physical address and it skipped over phone number and was still able to find us exactly what we were looking for using just a subset of the data points that were presented here. And so I think that's really, a very telling example of why you would potentially want to stitch together these underlying Reltio APIs in an orchestration, the likes of which we just saw playing out in the MuleSoft environment.
Hey, so, Matt.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to read this particular chat question just because it has some code-like stuff in there. This way you can, but if you want to read it out loud or whatever, that would be good.
Okay, so this is one from Deepak. You're referring to this one?
Yeah.
Is there a way to restrict key value pair in Reltio response? Example, instead of getting JSON export for attribute name as name with all of the verbose stuff. So absolutely is the answer. I'm not sure if you posted this question just before I was explaining the nature of this payload, but definitely I took the opportunity in the underlying MuleSoft API that I deployed, that I stripped out a lot of that complexity from that resulting JSON and turned it into what I think is a cleaner and yet still complete enough representation here for a calling application to be able to make sufficient use of. So hopefully, Deepak, that answers that question.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. And it looks like another question just came in.
Yeah, let me read that quickly. In the presented three-layer API architecture, can you give any particular example where experience API would be useful, since both source and consumer are talking to the system API, if I understood it right?
I think it's considered, and I don't pretend to understand all of the details here, so I probably can't give you the most relevant example, but certainly this is something that MuleSoft as our trusted partner considers to be a best practice architecture, and they do talk about these experience APIs being a high level kind of conditional orchestration of different places to go to call different kinds of services to get answers to different kinds of questions. So if you think about a web form where I've logged in as a customer of a particular consumer-facing organization, there are probably going to be a number of different buttons available to me to perform different tasks. So tell me about my accounts, tell me about my status, let me update some of my personal details. And I think these experience APIs are really directly what's behind each of those buttons that knows where to go to fulfill the requirements and get the customer to the end point that they're seeking to.
Thank you. And one last kind of question before you get going. Also with multiple paths to choose in the API, does this impact performance? And what are the do and don'ts to keep complex API routing performant?
So that might well be another question that I would want to deflect and say that a MuleSoft counterpart will probably provide a better answer to with regard to best practices. But certainly, if you look at, and we'll go back to the presentation for a second so that we can reference this, and specifically back to this representation. So what's going on here is I'm following only one pathway or the other. So I'm definitely making a decision here. So the overhead of calling a MuleSoft API, which then in turn is calling a single Reltio API, is not particularly high in my experiences so far. It's not significantly higher than just calling the Reltio API natively. And also, worst case scenario in terms of your turnaround time here, you follow this path and you fail in your attempt here to find an answer to the question which would have taken you there, and you find yourself having to prepare another payload and make another API call. This is actually one of the longest running API calls internally in Reltio anyway, because there's a lot of work to do to run through several match rules and see what answers you get as an end result. But even that said, the last API call that we just made in my demo app, I think took a little under 800 milliseconds to run through this entire not particularly highly tuned example with regard to the tenant that it's pointing at. So that's kind of worst case scenario, and it's still, in my opinion, an acceptable result. But I think there's an opportunity here to make sure that you branch in appropriate ways rather than call API after API after API in sequence and then have to wait potentially for the last API to finish before you get the answer to your question, which of course is going to add overall to your total latency.
Thank you. And just some comments. So one person said, hey, that was a great question. It was pretty much took mine. So it could be a potential, maybe partnering with MuleSoft to do a webinar like this, just to think about, opportunities there. And then he said some of the language is very jargon heavy. It makes sense to me from a user perspective, but don't ask me to explain it. So
I apologize. I made a lot of assumptions about who my audience was today, and if it's been very heavy in jargon, then I'm sorry if I've alienated anybody.
I think he gets it. I think that as we kind of continue these types of webinars, we'll learn more to think about who the best audience in the way we present this information. So, okay, Matt, keep going. Thank you.
Yeah, so I actually, where we were going to go next was to turn it over to questions anyway, unless there are, and as part of these questions, a need to dive deeper into any of the things that I've covered today, which I'm perfectly prepared to do. I even have my MuleSoft environment up and running in the background, should we need to segue to that and go in any detail as to how we've prepared in a MuleSoft specific way any of what you've seen today.
Well, great. Are we going to cover, so Matt, we were just talking about this, but get ready for this question. Are we going to cover Kafka integrations?
Yeah, so Chris and I were chatting about this before today's session. Probably can't cram it into the remaining 20 minutes of what we've got going on today, and I haven't necessarily prepared particularly well for that. So I think, Chris, if you're okay with it, we'll set up an additional session to talk specifically about Kafka, how Reltio can support it, and dedicate a session to that and to other kinds of asynchronous integrations.
I like that idea, and we'll definitely do that. So we do have a question. So apart from MuleSoft, what are the ways to build experienced APIs?
So we see, I'm using MuleSoft as a very specific example, and I'm choosing it because they're a partner and their software is available to me to have learned in the ways, or at least as far as I've gotten so far. But there are other customers out there not using MuleSoft, but using what are considered to be an equivalent of those. So an example would be Apigee. I've also used even SnapLogic, which is not doesn't present itself as an API-led or an API-oriented piece of software, but there's every possibility to stand up pipelines in SnapLogic, deploy them as callable endpoints in a cloud, and still get similar results, maybe not with necessarily the same scalability or control as you get with MuleSoft, but anything that can deploy a service to a cloud and package up a pipeline in the ways that we've discussed today could be considered to be fit for purpose.
Thanks, Matt. And another question, can we share documented best practices for the async integrations?
That's probably something I'm going to need to look to our documentation team and our support and professional services teams to understand what best practices already exist out there. Certainly in that session that we're alluding to here and promising for the future on Kafka, I can talk about practices, whether or not they're best practices. I can talk about techniques and from a pure point of view, what can you do to make best use of Kafka from a Reltio perspective?
Yeah, we'll definitely have to do that session, by the way. And if there are other sessions that you're all looking for, let me know, and I will do the best I can to make those happen. A couple of questions, or at least comments. One question, do you have a transliteration API that covers main countries like, China, Korea, Japan, Thailand, sorry.
So there is transliteration currently and quite recently enabled in Reltio. I'm scratching my head to find a good way to describe it, but I believe it's really in the context of matching, data matching. So it would come into effect more when we're using the matching API than it would necessarily if we're trying to query for exact attribute matches to particular criteria.
Okay.
And Matt, I can reinforce that as part of the 21.2 release, which just came out today, that transliteration with matching is part of that release.
Thanks, John. A couple of comments and maybe some questions here. So when async stream publish events, does it provide event type and entire entity payload being updated / deleted or created?
The answer is yes. So when we talk about this asynchronous stream outbound from Reltio, which is really the only way that Reltio does support asynchronous, on the inbound side, you would turn a streaming event into an API call for Reltio in order for Reltio to be updated. But on the outbound side, Reltio currently natively supports AWS SQS, AWS SNS, Google PubSub, and Azure Service Bus. And in the context, for example, of something like AWS SQS, then the published event has a type, and that type will be one of a whole plethora of different types that are considered materially interesting to the outside world, like entity changed, entity added, entities matched, merged, unmerged, those kinds of things. Now, when it concerns an entity being added or changed, then it will include a representation in that JSON payload of the entity itself in its entirety. If it's simply talking about an entity that merged or was unmerged, it will refer just to the URIs of the underlying entities and therefore won't be as complete as you're asking about here. And I can see the follow-on question, Chris, as well, which is with regard to Dell Boomi as a potential equivalent from an API management point of view. I think Dell Boomi would position themselves right up there as a viable solution. And it was an omission on my part to even mention Dell as I was listing some different technologies that can do this, but they would definitely position themselves as being able to and being a viable partner to you.
Yeah, and the comment here is, looking forward to the session on publishing to Kafka. We have an immediate use case for Kafka. So
Okay,
Maybe
that's
maybe
great.
we should, maybe we should push that a little quicker than, I don't, it'd be up to your schedule, Matt, but
Well, I'll make myself available to your customer service rep and your account exec if you want to accelerate a conversation, so that we can give you the best current understanding of Kafka, how we can support it. So we can kind of take that offline and work to accelerate that.
yeah, I appreciate that. And any other comments? So if you like this session, please let me know. Hopefully it was helpful to you. Please post that in the comments, and then, please add other sessions that might be helpful to you. Any other questions?
Where we can find this recording for this session? I joined a little late.
Yep. My goal is early next week or even later this week. It's being recorded. It will be posted on community.reltio.com. And if you actually RSVP that to this, I'll also take the PowerPoint, which isn't a ton of info, but it's some pretty good info, and attach it to the community. So I will make sure that you guys get it and email directly if you're on the community, which most of you are. So
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Great session. Thanks for a nice session. Yep, I'll definitely record it. And then I think this will make some of our partner marketing efforts much more efficient. Great, Nigel. So if there's not any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop here. Matt, any other parting thoughts?
No, thanks for the great questions that kind of padded out the understanding for the community as a whole. I've enjoyed presenting to you all today. Thank you very much for attending.
All right, well, with that, I'm going to stay on for another minute or maybe 3, just in case something pops up, but you're welcome to go. So thank you everyone for coming, and please sign up for the other community webinars coming up very soon, and we'll continue to have those. I am not going to have any in August because everyone goes on vacation, but we will also start that. So we have some in July and the rest of June, and then we'll start back up in September, October, into November. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
You too. So Matt, great session, lots of participation, lots of really great questions. Loved it. I think there's an appetite, for this kind of stuff. So I think we hit on something really big. I mean, it's complicated stuff, right?
Yeah. No, thanks for the opportunity. It was good fun. It was a little bit shorter than I expected it to kind of play out, but I was probably talking too fast.
No, I think it's good. I mean, you never know the right exact amount. So, we'll know for the next one. So I think maybe early September, would that be good, Matt? Or if you could do one quicker, that'd be great. But if not, we can look at September.
No, I think we can do one sooner than that. It does seem like there's Kafka is a hot topic.
Yeah,
Excuse the
I
pun.
agree. So Jay was like, thanks. Please arrange more sessions like this, especially around the new features offered by Reltio. I like that. I did talk to the PM team to let's do a session or 2 around some of the really cool new features, so we'll see what happens with that.
And to this community, depending on how long they've been a Reltio customer, something like the Swagger API portal is something that's quite new into the mix. Very, very useful. What we had before this in terms of documentation and examples of APIs was a little bit lacking, but it's come a long way very, very quickly. It's really exciting. That's
good. Maybe you can help me figure out who that person is at Reltio to push that session. All right, everybody. That's a wrap for today. Thank you for coming, and I appreciate your feedback and everything else. So thanks again, Matt.
Yep, thank you. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Jay, for all your comments. I'm a client site where they constantly ask information about new features. I believe session or, yep, I will for sure. All right, take care, everybody.